Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you...
Hello and welcome back to Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, a Fans Guided by Voices podcast. My name is Jeff Gomez and I'm the author of Zeppelin over Dayton, Guided by Voices album by album, which is available wherever books are sold. In this episode, I'll be looking at the band's third and final LP of 2020 and 31st overall, Styles We Paid For. Visit everygbvlp.com to listen to past episodes covering every GBV studio album, special bonus episodes, and the 27-track Guided by Voices tribute record called How Do You Spell GBV? Now let's get to the show.
You specialize in neckties and
Okay, we are back and looking at the band's third and final record of 2020, Styles We Paid For. The album obviously caps a productive year for the group, not to mention a pretty rotten year for mankind. As I record this, well over 300,000 Americans have died of the coronavirus, and we had pretty much the most bitter and contentious presidential election in history. So in a topsy-turvy world where nothing seems to make sense, it's reassuring that we can rely on Bob and the new classic lineup. Pollard's released 10 full-length albums since resurrecting GBV back in 2016 with Please Be Honest. And as if that wasn't enough, 2 of those 10 records were doubles. The quality of those records has also been high, at least once Bob solidified the lineup in 2017. This is not the grab bag of the reunion years, where a lot of those albums felt rushed and thin, and each of them had, to my ears anyway, too many tracks. Instead, the group's producing exceptionally good records, and they're putting them out pretty damn quick. And in terms of the too many songs question, 2 of the 3 LPs the band put out this year, including this one, contain a relatively restrained 15 tracks. So Styles We Paid For, while not as strong as Mirrored Aztec, is still a very fine record and a worthwhile addition to the band's legacy. Of the 3 LPs the band put out this year, I put Aztec first, this one Styles second, and Poppy third. And while the band takes a lot of stick for releasing lots of records, with many people suggesting that they just take the best tracks after 6 months of recording and make an all-killer, no-filler album, that's just not what Bob does. Instead, Pollard, at least within the last 5 or 6 years, makes these LPs as distinct entities. He writes a batch of songs, demos them on his boombox, puts together a sequence, and then sends CDs, which act as a sort of blueprint, to the band and producer Travis Harrison. Also included are some basic instructions in terms of how Bob wants the tracks to sound. The band and Harrison then use these cues and ideas when working up the arrangements and instrumental backing for the tracks. Now, as I said, this is the 3rd record in a year. Working as he does with Harrison and the guys, the band recording the instruments, and Bob just adding his vocals over the top later, allows Pollard to, as he puts it, pump out songs. We've known for a long time that Bob's not a perfectionist. He doesn't chase sounds as much as he just stamps them out. I think the reason for this is he's striving for pure numbers, or to put it another way, statistics. Why is this important to him? Well, you have to keep in mind that Pollard comes to rock and roll from the point of view of an athlete. He played football, basketball, and baseball. It was this last one in which he excelled. He pitched numerous no-hitters while a student at Wright State University. And if there's one thing that's important in baseball, it's statistics. Chuck Klosterman is a writer whose work I enjoy. Like Bob, he seems to like music and sports in equal measure, and here's what he has to say about statistics and why they matter. The reason we keep statistics is because we assume some sort of emotional experience will accompany their creation and obliteration. These moments are supposed to be a positive amalgamation of awe, evolution, inspiration, admiration, and the macrobiotic potential of man. I believe the reason Pollard's keen to continue pumping out these records is because he sees the sheer number of them as an accomplishment. That's why we get 3 records a year, all of which are pretty good, rather than getting 1 album every 2 or 3 years, which is a grand and ambitious statement. Athletes are great in the aggregate, and so is Bob. In terms of the band's latest, as Bob told Rolling Stone back in October, I finished the demos on February 29th and sent them to the band. I was planning on an all-analog album entitled Before Computers. The pandemic obviously changed our recording plans, and ironically, it was all recorded digitally on computers. The band members recorded their parts in isolation in 5 different states. I'm glad that Pollard here realizes the irony of the situation. As I mentioned before, he's not only a guy who's just not interested in technology, but he seems actively hostile to it. In a number of songs over his career, including a few on this record, he's decried the creeping mechanization and resulting dehumanization which he believes comes from a society which is overly reliant on technology. And yet in this situation, it pretty much saved the day. Whether this will cause Bob to rethink any of his long-held views on the subject, who knows? But at least in the short term, he's embracing the new technology because, well, he has to. And anyway, the band's been functioning this way for years. As Doug Gillard told Discogs, we've been doing some parts from home for the album since 2017. So the difference to me is not being able to track our basics straight to tape and altogether as we have done for a few of the recent albums. Another reason I find Bob's anti-technology stance so puzzling and slightly disingenuous is that by recording via any sort of mechanical means, he's embracing technology. That boombox of his was in fact the pinnacle of innovation back in 1986. So it's less that Pollard doesn't like technology, it's more that he doesn't like today. He's hostile to the present, not the iPhone. In the same article, producer Travis Harrison admitted that the band constantly uses computers anyway, so in reality, not much has changed. Meet the new process, same as the old process. I should also state that a number of the record's demos were sent to fans in advance of the album's release as part of the Hot Freaks subscription service. 2 of them can also be heard on the 7-inch that came with Pollard's collage and literary magazine Eat, which published its 16th issue this summer. Now, before we talk about the new record, I want to mention a few other things that happened since the release of the last record and talk for a second about what next year is going to bring. The only other side project or non-GBV release from Bob in the past year has been the Cash Rivers album Bad Side of the Coin, which came out in October. This is the 4th and supposedly final record from Cash Rivers and the Sinners. The LP, which features a whopping 35 tunes, was issued in a limited vinyl edition of just 1,000 copies and is already sold out. The packaging's really amazing. The sleeve is die cut, foil stamped, and comes in a 3D embossed jacket. It looks like a big coin, a reference to the record's title. The design is an homage, if not exact copy, of the 1971 Grand Funk Railroad record E Pluribus Funk. For me, the Cash Rivers LPs have been pretty hit or miss. I thought the 2018 double record, Do Not Try to Adjust Your Set, I'm the Vertical and the Horizontal, was a masterpiece. 2019's Loose Shoes, however, didn't do anything for me, awash as it was in Viagra and Cialis jokes. The new record, as much as I've listened to it, seems to fall more in line with Loose Shoes than Do Not Try to Adjust Your Set. The reason I liked Adjust Your Set so much is because a lot of the songs saw Bob and the guys trying on a host of musical styles. The Cash Rivers project started as a country music parody, but that record had kids songs and chillwave and spot-on parodies of all kinds of genres. It was clever in addition to crude. The newer Cash Rivers albums, for me anyway, lean too far into the realm of sophomoric humor. For example, on Bad Side of the Coin, I only got as far as track 12, after being put off by the trio of songs To the Waistband, Sugar Booger Baby, and Sir Wackanoff. The first one's about someone who has shit stains to the waistband. The second one contains the lines, She looks down at me, she smells just like pee. And the final one begins, How long do you think I can push it until she catches me whacking off? I hate to say it, but that kind of material makes Ween look like Philip Glass. When you contrast this with the stately and mature Tobin Sprout record that came out the previous month, it's almost shocking. Quite frankly, I find it absolutely baffling that Bob and the guys would spend as much time as they do on a track like Baby's Taking a Shit. I mean, I get that the genesis of all of this is Bob sitting around with his buddies. He makes up funny songs like these and it cracks everybody up. I'm sure he's been doing this for years. In fact, since some of the songs like Corn Country go back to his youth, this is something Bob's been doing since he was a kid. Now that people have iPhones and can record these off-the-cuff moments, we get Cash Rivers. But how that buzzed moment in the Monument Club or at a tequila bar then leads to getting his band to record fairly elaborate versions of what amounts to basically made-up-on-the-spot novelty songs, I just don't know. It reminds me of the story of when the French writer Voltaire visited a male brothel. When someone asked him the next day if he was going to go again that night, he quipped, "Once a philosopher, twice a pervert." At any rate, Bad Side of the Coin was released on Shit and Shit Records and is, as I mentioned before, supposedly the last we're going to hear from Cash Rivers. I say, good riddance. Issue 16 of Bob's literary magazine Eat, entitled Planet Cake, also came out since the release of Mirrored Aztec. It's in the new large format, same as the previous issue, and it comes with a 7-song, 7-inch of boombox recordings. 2 of the 7 tracks, they don't play the drums anymore, and When Growing Was Simple, have been re-recorded for Styles We Paid For. Same as the last issue of Eat, the EP's absolutely awful. Bob puts in 0 effort in terms of the recordings, and since we know that this is what Travis and the guys are working from, I would think they'd be in line for a Nobel instead of a Grammy. One thing that's interesting to note about the latest issue of Eat is that a number of the collages have names that go back to the early 90s. One is called Kisses to the Crying Cooks, which is a track off of the Fast Japanese Spin Cycle EP, while another is named Corpse-Like Sleep of Stupidity, the name of an early version of B-1000. One's also called A Necklace of 50 Eyes, which is from a lyric on Yours to Keep from B-1000. Whether this means Bob's getting lazy and is simply recycling old names and phrases from his past, or whether he's getting somewhat wistful and nostalgic as he enters his 7th decade on the planet, I'm not sure. Or maybe these are just old collages he's had sitting around for 30 years. One more thing to note before talking about Styles is that in the run-up to the release of the album, Bob was asked by Rolling Stone to contribute to their list of 500 greatest albums of all time. As part of this, Pollard, as well as some other performers, were asked to share their top 50. Bob's features mainly the usual suspects: the Beatles, Wire, Genesis, David Bowie. The biggest surprise, for me anyway, was the inclusion of the 70s singer-songwriter classic Tapestry coming in at number 38 on the list. In a funny pairing, Carole King is one place ahead of the debut by King Crimson. And as we close 2020, Bob's given us a hint of what's in store for next year. Pollard and the band's readying a new side project. It's called Cub Scout Bowling Pins, and an EP entitled Heaven Beats Iowa is set to appear in January 2021. As Mark Shue told Discogs, it's a slightly different creative process than GBV, adding that we're all super psyched on it. Moving on to Styles We Paid For, the cover is interesting in that it's a Pollard collage, but it doesn't look like any of his previous ones. Instead of the off-kilter effect Bob usually gets in mixing, matching, and creating contrasts and new creations by combining disparate elements, the image for Styles consists of 3 groovy guys who look like they're right out of the JCPenney or Sears catalog from the 70s. These guys are placed on top of what seems to be a random assortment of letters and numbers, except upon closer inspection, you can find the last name of all band members word search style. I also want to mention that the matte finish on the cover and what feels to be possibly some extra heavy cardboard make for an arresting package. The back features just the song titles and an image of an American flag in 2 different sizes. The vinyl edition features the lyrics printed on a piece of heavy cardstock, while the CD digipack features the words printed on a booklet. The title itself, Styles We Paid For, has been around for a long time. The opening and closing tracks on the first Suitcase compilation, which was released back in 2004, were credited to the fake band Styles We Paid For. Once again, there were no singles or videos for any tracks. First LP of the year, Surrender Your Poppy Field, had 2 singles, but neither this record nor the previous one, Mirrored Aztec, had a single issued from it. And a video hasn't been made since 2018's See My Field. In terms of reviews, Guitar.com gave the LP a 7 out of 10, writing that, at various points we're in garage rock, lo-fi power pop, prog, psych, and British invasion territory, without ever setting up camp for too long in any of those stylistic regions. Website Brooklyn Vegan proclaimed Styles We Paid For their album of the week. They described the record as being full of Pollard's signature anthemic rock songs steeped in The Who, Wire, and all of his other favorite stuff, but sounding only like GBV. The review adds that Bob never seems to run out of tunes, nor the band riffs, and never lets his songs go on longer than needed. Kevin Korber, writing on the website Spectrum Culture, describes the sound of Styles We Paid For as being alien lanes as filtered through the lens of Half Smile of the Decomposed. However, that's not meant as a compliment. Korber goes on to describe the new album as a deeply disjointed record in the worst way, writing that one moment you're listening to the chiming guitars and Endless Seafood or Crash at Lake Placebo, and you think that Pollard is having a new renaissance, only for something like Mr. Child or Electronic Windows to Nowhere to bring proceedings to a screeching halt with a dearth of melodies and tempo shifts that seem to exist only for the sake of it. In revisiting that anything-goes record-making aesthetic, Pollard has unfortunately created an album most notable for how uneven it is. Matt Morris at Spill Magazine rates the record at 3 out of 5, writing that, while nothing on the album is bad, only a few songs truly stick out. With very little instrumental variation and few changes in tempo, songs quickly start to blend into each other. He sums up the situation with, while Guided by Voices are too consistent for Styles We Paid For to qualify as an actual misfire, it'll probably be forgotten when the band inevitably releases its next deluge of new music. Shindig Magazine liked it more, awarding the LP 4 stars and calling it another uber hooky power pop feast. Now let's look at the album track by track. The LP opens with Megaphone Riley.
You specialize in neckties and you're not acting. Just for a king, a spoiled child to be exact.
This slow burner of an opener is the perfect way to start the record. It takes a while to get going, opening with just Pollard and an electric guitar, but soon additional instruments are added until, at the minute and a half mark, the whole band comes crashing in. It's super cathartic and a great touch. I only wish the song kept going. It's pretty short at a few seconds past 2 minutes. The lyrics are mostly surreal but contain some arresting imagery, such as highlight the pages, scour the ages for new blood, and you lead the army to slaughter and force the horses to drink the poison water. Bob even mentions a jumbo virus, which may or may not be COVID-19. And of course, the title, Megaphone Riley, reminds me of another opening track, Baba O'Reilly, from Who's Next, an album that came in at number 4 on that Rolling Stone list of Pollard's top 50 records I mentioned before. A curious thing about the song is that it's very similar in structure and tune to Whole Tomatoes off August by Cake. I find that odd since Cake's not a very old album. It's one thing to dig up a Suitcase track from the 90s or to cop a riff off Do the Collapse, but to borrow from such a recent release seems awfully complacent. At any rate, the second track on the record is They Don't Play the Drums Anymore.
They play electric lily pads on cool blue Amazons. They float on.
I have to say, whereas I've enjoyed some of Pollard's polemical works in the past, such as Useless Inventions, here his anti-technology stance comes off as merely crotchety. He's ranting rather than reasoning. For example, he laments that, well, as he says in the title, they don't play the drums anymore. I assume he means bands, and to a degree, he's right. If you listen to top 40 radio these days, you don't hear real drums. You also don't hear any guitar, but I guess that's a subject for another song. Instead, what you get is, as Bob writes here, flat digital airwaves. He then goes on to list a few famous drummers, Keith Moon, of course, from The Who, in addition to jazz legends such as Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa. And whereas the past was replete with legends like these, in their prestigious place, we're left merely with guys beating their puds and staring at their screensavers. While I'm fine if Pollard chooses to personally eschew technology, I think it's pretty ridiculous to be disdainful of others who elect to embrace it. And sure, while a whole lot of new music is shit, there's a lot of crap in the 60s and 70s too. Just because a record has real drums doesn't make it good. Besides, Bob's in a glass houses situation when he accuses the younger generation of wasting their lives. They may be in fact engaging in online onanism, but he's the one actually writing songs about whacking off. Musically, the song's just okay. Hearing it, you sort of wish, since Bob's such a fan of, the drums, that he would have given Kevin March more of a canvas to show exactly why drums are good and what's lost when they're not played. Instead, we get a short track where the drums are no more integral than any of the other instruments. It doesn't help make his point. A demo of the track was included as part of the 7-inch that came with the latest issue of Eat Magazine, which was called Planet Cake. Here's what that sounds like.
They play electric lily pads on cool blue Amazons.
It's kind of funny that Pollard here is just on an acoustic guitar. Even he doesn't play the drums. Moving on, step into the Slaughterhouse.
Someone didn't laugh at the joke. Down at the Slaughterhouse.
At 4 minutes and 33 seconds, this is by far the longest track on the album. It's a minute longer than the next longest song. Now for me, this one was a real grower, the same as Transfusion from the previous LP Mirrored Aztec. The first few times I heard it, I didn't like it. It was too slow, and Bob's sloppy vocal towards the end ruined it for me. I find that this sometimes happens with GBV. Because Pollard is so adept at melody, when one doesn't quickly appear, I tend to get restless and or lose interest. But now I love this song. It's super heavy and a nice change of pace for the band. Seeing as Bob is a vegetarian, you might think that with a name like Slaughterhouse, this would be an anti-killing anthem in the style of Meat is Murder by the Smiths. Instead, Pollard seems to be describing stuff that happens at the slaughterhouse rather than inside of it. It's about the workplace, not the place of animals or meat in our society. What Slaughterhouse is slyly doing is documenting something perhaps as brutal as the killing of animals, the death of the hopes of the people who get paid to kill the animals. People who work in this dangerous profession are, as Bob writes here, caught in the spiderweb soul and are sucking bacteria in. Conditions in slaughterhouses have never been good. Upton Sinclair's classic 1906 novel, The Jungle, exposed the horrid and dangerous conditions immigrants endured while trying to earn a living in Chicago's stockyards. And while the book became a progressive cause célèbre and led to modest reforms, the job remains awfully dangerous and is still performed mainly by immigrants or those at the bottom of the workforce ladder. The coronavirus has only made things worse. According to an article on BuzzFeed News, during the first wave of the pandemic, the meatpacking industry emerged as an early and shocking hotspot. There's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, the inherent nature of the job makes it difficult to protect workers. Here's how CNBC put it. The conditions of the meatpacking industry, which requires many workers to be in close contact with each other for long shifts, make social distancing nearly impossible. And then, of course, the same as in Sinclair's day, the owner of the plants just plain don't want to lose profits, so employees have to keep working even when it became fully evident that the factories and killing floors were hotbeds of disease. Simply put, a slaughterhouse is not a fun place to be, and Bob and the band get at the heart of that sentiment perfectly with this slow and sludgy tune. Next up, tuck into Endless Seafood. This is another super solid track. It manages to not sound much like anything else in the band's voluminous and esteemed discography, and yet it's undeniably GBV. For the first 2 minutes, it's a quick and bright pop song with fun lyrics, but the last minute is slow and stately with synth strings and layered vocals by Bob. It's a lot of fun and sounds just great. In terms of the title, Pollard's not writing here about the never-ending shrimp feast at Red Lobster. A restaurant I once worked at, by the way. Those cheesy biscuits are incredibly delicious. Instead, the title refers to the endless array of romantic choices which present themselves over the course of a life. Pollard writes, "Declarings of love are cheap. With so many fish in the sea, which one will it always be?" No matter how we might want to romantically think of true love as something unending and singular, Bob knows better, noting that it's not very hard to do and that shattered faces, many more, have their places at the door. It's a mature, if not somewhat cynical, view of love. It's also an effective track that adds a lot to side one. Speaking of, the first side starts to wind down with Mr. Child.
Mr. Child, Mr. Child sails a roll with the punctures and remain as a child.
Stereogum called this strong tune a character sketch of a Peter Pan figure who refuses to let go of his youth. That sounds a lot like Pollard, a guy who, now well into his 60s, spends his days the way he did when he was a kid, making collages and writing songs. British writer Paul Robert Mullen, writing in the arts magazine Fusion, which is part of the Berklee College of Music, the alma mater of current GBV drummer Kevin March, by the way, wrote about musicians who get old but continue to record and play live. In the article entitled "Peter Pan is Rock and Roll, Are Aging Musicians Still Relevant?", Mullen writes that it may be that innate quest to create, or the stimulation that music brings to the brain, or the thrill of human interaction in performing, that triggers a will to ignore and evade the aging process, to simply carry on regardless. Because really, what's the alternative? As Mullen writes a few lines later, retirement is synonymous with death. You are not expected to die whilst in a job. So Bob just keeps keeping on, and we all reap the rewards. Second to last song on side 1 is Stops.
Never stops being great as long as I'm with you. The first stop I should make, but is to try a lot of single days. Will no one ever find you?
This is an absolutely gorgeous track, showing the band firing on all cylinders. Producer Travis Harrison does a great job creating a shimmeringly emotional instrumental backdrop for one of the Bob's best vocal deliveries in recent memory. The opening is also the most unabashedly romantic thing Pollard has penned in a long time, writing, "It never stops being great as long as I'm with you." In fact, the overall tone is wistful and romantic. It actually reminds me of Warp and Woof's similarly pensive Down the Island. And even though it's another of the LP's short songs, it's only a few seconds past 2 minutes, I wouldn't add a thing or want it to be any longer. It's easily my favorite song on the first side. Basically, when Bob and the band buckle down to create something truly spectacular, this is what it sounds like. Last song on side 1 is War of the Devils.
Young man speed cried, shock and disbelief. Old man slow left, where did it go? Production and consent.
Side 1 goes out on an absolute high note with this prog-influenced track that ranges all over the place before finishing with an apocalyptic crescendo. It starts with what sounds like a harpsichord before diving into a raging stomper, which soon gives way to a somber middle section that itself quickly segues to slashing electric guitars. It's an amazing song and one from the LP that I'd love to see performed live. First song on side 2 is Electronic Windows to Nowhere.
Shameless and I'm glad I'm streaming with artificial intelligence. Get some fun meeting the multi-level presidents.
This is another track that traces some of Bob's evident dislike of computers, the electronic windows of the lyrics in the title, presumably being those boxes on a phone or laptop screen. Pollard also rails against artificial intelligence and shameless streaming, which is again ironic since the band live-streamed a concert over the summer. All of that aside, the song's a lot of fun. Pollard's voice sounds great, he hits more high notes than I can count, and the overall feel is sort of new wave. That's probably Kevin March playing real drums, but it sounds like a drum machine, and the last 40 seconds just soars. It's a great way to start side 2. Second track on the second side is Never Abandon Ship.
One tooth gnash, insincere gladness of the horse's mouth, said boredom beats sadness.
I absolutely love this song. It's one of my favorite tracks on the album. It's short at just under 2 minutes, but there's so much going on and there's such abundant space instrumentally that it feels total and complete, even though it doesn't necessarily last very long. The rhythm on this is also a lot of fun, getting away from Pollard's habit of every track having nothing but downstrokes. There are also some great guitar flourishes, and Travis Harrison adds other touches that brighten and make the song special. I also love the message here. Bob's telling us to never abandon ship, which I see as a message synonymous with his prior paean to self-belief, Don't Stop Now. Pollard, for a long time in his 30s, when he was writing songs but his quote-unquote band was going nowhere, was told by pretty much everyone around him, his family, his first wife, and so on, to indeed abandon ship, basically to give up on his dreams. But Bob never did. And if I can use another water-based metaphor, he knew he was swimming against the tide in terms of what he was offering, as he writes here, "See what we bring, half empty, half complete." It was unlikely he was going to set the world on fire with the cracked and lo-fi songs he was recording in his basement with his buddies, and yet we now know that that's exactly what he did. He's here because, as he advises us in this song, he never abandoned the good ship guided by voices. Sometimes that kind of singular and unwavering confidence in oneself can lead to ruin, as it did to Captain Ahab, who also didn't abandon ship, though his story has a much less happy ending. But in our daily lives, it's good to, as Bob writes here, no longer concede defeat. Basically, don't let the bastards get you down. Next up, Roll Me to Heaven.
The
This is the second of a trio of prog-influenced tracks on the record. It sees Bob and the band blitz through a number of different musical styles and tempos in a song that's not even 2.5 minutes long. What it took Genesis or Yes to do in 10 minutes, GBB does here in under 3. It's a powerful track. Instrumentally, it caroms from heavy riffs to pounding drums to gorgeously pastoral guitars and tambourine. It's also filled with arresting lyrical passages, such as the scent of something strangling your mother's friends, not to mention the usual Pollard wordplay. Instead of outer space, he writes outer spates. The band sounds great, and Bob does too. It's the kind of multi-part, complicated song that this new class of lineup not only excels at, but has truly made their own. It's a gem. Now, get out your slide rules. It's Incalculous Stratagem.
Pillars of stand with the eminent strength of an army, but it won't matter. Let me move blindly below.
Side 2 continues its absolute winning streak with this, easily my favorite track on the album. It's absolutely gorgeous, and the only fault I can find is that it's way too short at just 2 minutes. Pollard's stubbornly short attention span here is practically self-sabotaging. It starts with an acoustic guitar and a droning keyboard in a style that reminds me of Bright Paper Werewolves from Under the Bushes, Under the Stars. But when the band comes in at around the minute mark, it could be argued to be the band's most beautiful and transcendent moment since Don't Stop Now from that same record. It's just absolutely gorgeous. A demo of Incalculous Stratagem was sent to the Hot Freaks subscribers over the summer. I won't play it here, but I want to mention that the final part in the finished song, where Bob says something like, "I walk through and so do you," wasn't in the initial demo. It's a great touch, and it enhances what was already an instant classic. Again, my only complaint is that it's too short, something which is only enhanced by the fact that the tune is barely faded out when the next song, Crash Like Placebo, begins. First of all, I love the feel of this, in place of the usual shower of relentless downstrokes that I think make a whole bunch of Bob's recent stuff sound samey. The track's made out of a rolling riff. It also, at close to 3 minutes, has a lot of space for some strong instrumental passages, including some super melodic flourishes from Doug Gillard and tasteful fills from Kevin March. That helps since the song doesn't have much of a structure. It's basically just 5 verses. But that doesn't matter because the tune's such a treat to listen to. It's one of the strongest on the album. The record starts to wind down with Liquid Kid.
Spattering nursery walls, swimming in dirty clothes, fathers and daughters, fathers and guns.
This is one of the longer tracks on the album, and it's another that finds the band in prog mode, careening through almost a half dozen styles and tempos in under 3.5 minutes. It's an absolute blast, and when some digital horns and a sinewy lead comes in towards the end, the song gets even better. For some reason, maybe because the track's about a young man who everybody wants to be, and thanks to the overall vibe of the tune, Liquid Kid reminds me of The Who's Pinball Wizard, which is pretty good company to be in, I'd say. This brings us to the second to last song, Time Without Looking. Clocking in at 1 minute and 43 seconds, this gorgeous and melancholy tune is the shortest on the album. Here, Pollard traces usually inscrutable wordplay for a straightforward reckoning of getting old, asking, "Time, where did it go?" Of course, this being Bob, he still puts in some arresting images and references, name-checking Neil Young's album After the Gold Rush, as well as the Paisley Underground band The Rain Parade. A clock or metronome appears halfway through the song, reinforcing the theme of time ticking away. But this is more than just a meditation of the passing minutes or even years. The title is an enigmatic acknowledgement from Pollard that he doesn't need to look at a clock to know the hour. After all, a clock, not to mention a calendar, is just an inert object made of plastic, paper, and numbers. It's our bodies that truly mark time. Hair growing gray, backs becoming stooped, eyesight blurring into white. Bob, who had surgery this year for a bum hip, to quote Dylan, doesn't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. He can, as he writes here, feel the time without looking. It's a sober and mature thought, given a wonderful treatment by Travis Harrison and the band. This leads us to the final track in the album, When Growing Was Simple.
When growing was simple, I sprouted.
The tune here, as well as the instrumentation, is minimal. There's no real melody, and the guitar is playing a 3 or 4 note sequence throughout the whole thing. But if the music's not entirely interesting, the lyrics are. And same as the previous song, it's a meditation and reflection from Bob about getting old. It's another track where the demo version was included on the Eat Magazine Planet Cake 7-inch. Here's what that sounds like.
When growing was simple, I sprouted.
The song was accompanied in the magazine by a collage featuring 5 disfigured portraits of Pollard, which were taken by his current wife. The fact that Bob's face is opposite the already autobiographical lyrics turns the words into a sort of history lesson. Pollard here looking back to his youth, to a time when, as he says in the title, growing was simple. He writes of being in the 4th grade and being graded, meaning the point where elementary school segues from making clay dinosaurs to figuring out fractions. Basically, it means that playtime is over. There's added significance in the fact that Pollard himself taught 4th grade for years. And even though sports was always a part of his youth, referenced here with the mention of cleats, he was also an artistic guy who drew flies and cartoons, a nod perhaps to the GBV album Same Place the Fly Got Smashed, which features a hand-drawn cover by Bob. Pollard also writes of his youth passing into adulthood, what he terms the Big Difficult, a time of airplanes and radios, cars and alcohol. The company General Motors gets a mention, which is significant because his brother Jim worked there for years. The same as the track Slaughterhouse from earlier in the album. When you're growing up in the Midwest, in a blue-collar area like Dayton, the choices presented to you as an adult are often slim. Jobs are often just that. It's just work, not a career, a way to put food on the table. And that's a lot more complicated than worrying about whether or not you have a date for the prom. The song's last line, Stay Home and Eat, sounds inspired by COVID-19. During a lockdown, created by a global pandemic, there's really not much else to do. Except, of course, you can also play some records, including maybe this one. You could do a lot worse. Okay, that's it for the show. Go to everygbvlp.com to listen to past episodes of this podcast. Go to rockathonrecords.com to buy Styles We Paid For on vinyl or CD. And be sure to check out my book about the band, Zeppelin Over Dayton, Guided by Voices, album by album. Thanks for listening. Have a happy holidays. Stay safe, stay home, and God bless the Monument Club.